the street looked ordinary, which was the most dangerous part of it. Harlem mornings carried routine like armor, shop gates rising, radios murmuring, uniforms passing without question. Authority usually announced itself with paperwork and whistles, not hands. That was why the slap landed so hard. A white police officer stopped an older black man for nothing at all, spoke just loudly enough to draw witnesses, then struck him across the face with practiced contempt. No baton followed. No arrest was made. The officer wanted humiliation, not chaos. People froze where they stood. A slap like that was not random violence. It was instruction. It reminded everyone watching who the city pretended belonged and who did not. The man who absorbed it did not shout or fall. He straightened, eyes steady, dignity bruised but intact. Those who recognized him felt their stomachs tighten. This was Bumpy Johnson's father, a man known quietly for his decency, his restraint, and the respect he commanded without demanding it. The officer walked away satisfied, believing the moment was finished. Harlem knew better. Insults that involved blood traveled differently. This one did not spark a riot because riots burn out. It sparked memory. Men looked at one another and said nothing, already understanding the weight of what they had witnessed. The slap was symbolic, meant to echo through families, through generations, through the idea that power could humiliate without consequence. Word moved faster than feet. By the time the father reached home, the story had already arrived ahead of him, altered only by tone. It was not exaggerated. It did not need to be. The detail that mattered was simple and devastating. A uniform had crossed a line that uniforms relied on never being challenged. This was not about injury. It was about erasure. Bumpy Johnson heard without asking questions. He did not need clarification. In Harlem, certain acts rang like bells. You could hear them long after the sound ended. He understood immediately that responding publicly would cheapen the offense. Public outrage would give the officer importance. Violence would turn humiliation into noise. Silence would let the insult breathe until it suffocated its author. The father did not demand vengeance. He carried himself the way he always had, with quiet pride and unbroken posture. That restraint deepened the wound rather than closing it. Men who saw him later that day lowered their voices instinctively. They sensed the clock had started, though no one knew where it would stop. Harlem had seen beatings before. It had seen murders. Those tragedies drew lines of fear. This moment drew a line of principle. Touching an elder was different. Touching a father was unforgivable. Touching this father was catastrophic. The slap rewrote expectations because it challenged not just a family, but an entire neighborhood's understanding of respect. No threats were made that day. No plans were announced. The officer returned to his routine, believing the city had swallowed the insult the way it always did. That belief was his first mistake. Harlem did not forget. It stored grievances carefully, allowing them to mature into consequence. By nightfall, the slap had become something else entirely. It was no longer an action, it was a signal. People spoke of it indirectly, circling the truth because saying it aloud felt dangerous. Everyone understood that humiliation demands correction, not immediately, but completely. Some violence draws blood, other violence draws attention. This violence drew inevitability. And as the sun set over Harlem, the street returned to looking ordinary again, disguising the fact that history had already leaned forward, waiting for the next 72 hours to finish the sentence the slap had begun. No one doubted then that the city itself would answer, slowly, deliberately, and without witnesses present. His father was not a man of headlines. He worked, spoke little, and carried himself with a posture that refused to bend even when the world leaned hard against him. In Harlem, that kind of steadiness was noticed. It taught without sermons. It corrected without force. He believed dignity was practiced, not announced. Clothes were clean, shoes were shined, words were chosen carefully because careless speech invited unnecessary trouble. He understood the rules of a city built to test black men quietly, and he met those tests with discipline rather than defiance. Survival, to him, was not submission. It was endurance with self-respect intact. Bumpy learned early that strength did not always arrive loudly. He watched his father absorb slights without shrinking, navigate unfair systems without begging, and protect his family through consistency instead of intimidation. The lessons were subtle but permanent. Power, his father showed him, was the ability to remain whole when circumstances tried to fracture you. Neighbors respected the elder Johnson not because he demanded it, but because he deserved it. He paid debts on time. He remembered names. He offered help without asking for credit. In a neighborhood where reputation often came from fear, his came from reliability. That kind of standing could not be bought or stolen. It was built day by day. The slap tore through that foundation. It was not an attack on a random passerby. It was an assault on a man who represented restraint in a place that rarely rewarded it. By striking him publicly, the officer challenged the idea that dignity itself carried value. That challenge traveled straight to the son who had been raised to understand exactly what such moments meant. This was not about pride wounded or anger sparked. It was about lineage. The insult reached backward into memory and forward into expectation. It questioned whether everything the father had modeled still mattered. Harlem felt that question immediately because many had been shaped by similar men who survived by teaching their children how to stand without provoking collapse. Bumpy did not see his father as weak. He saw him as principled. That distinction mattered. Violence against such a man was not an act of dominance. It was a confession of moral bankruptcy. The officer had not proven authority. He had exposed its corruption. For Bumpy, the humiliation cut deeper than any threat aimed at himself. He had chosen his own path, accepted its risks, and understood its consequences. His father had chosen none of that. He had simply lived with integrity. Touching him collapsed the boundary between criminal consequence and innocent dignity. The father said little afterward. He did not recount the moment dramatically or demand action. His silence carried weight. It told his son that outrage was easy and response required thought. That quiet became instruction, just as so many lessons before it had. By understanding who the father was, the city understood why this moment could not dissolve into rumor. It had violated something foundational. Respect here was inherited as much as it was earned. To strike the man who raised Bumpy Johnson was to misunderstand how deeply values were rooted. This humiliation could not be ignored because ignoring it would erase the meaning of everything that came before. Bumpy had learned power from watching a man who never claimed it. Now he faced a test that asked whether those lessons would be honored or abandoned. The answer would not come in words, but in the careful application of consequence shaped by memory, restraint, and an unbreakable sense of who had been wronged. That reckoning would move slowly, teaching Harlem that respect for elders was not negotiable, and that lineage, once dishonored, demanded restoration without spectacle or public explanation ever. He wore the badge like a shield that could not crack. Years on the force had taught him which corners were quiet, which complaints vanished, and which faces would never be believed. He was not clever, only confident, and confidence had always been enough. Paperwork bent to his version of events. Partners looked away. Supervisors preferred fewer questions. The city taught him that force, used casually, carried no cost. He had slapped men before, pushed women, broken rules that never reached ink. Each time, the world continued unchanged, and that continuity hardened into permission. Authority, unchecked, becomes habit. Habit becomes reflex. The reflex tells you that uniforms erase consequences, that pain delivered quickly disappears. He learned that lesson too well. The street that day felt ordinary. Noise, traffic, eyes sliding past uniforms the way they always did. He did not plan humiliation. He practiced it. The slap arrived the way a door shuts, abrupt and unconsidered. It was meant to remind, not to punish, to signal hierarchy without paperwork. He did not see a man with a history. He saw a body that would absorb it. Witnesses registered the moment without reacting. He mistook that stillness for fear. In truth, it was recognition. Harlem had seen this pattern and knew how it ended, even when the ending took time. The officer read the room incorrectly because the room was not for him. His confidence was built from repetition. Every prior incident had ended with silence, and silence taught him safety. He told himself he was maintaining order. He told himself resistance required correction. He told himself the badge was armor, the stories stacked neatly, insulating him from doubt. What he did not understand was scale, not the size of the man he struck, but the reach of the insult. He believed harm was measured by bruises and reports. He never learned how humiliation travels through families, how it gathers witnesses who do not speak but remember. He believed the uniform ended stories. He was wrong. After the slap, he returned to routine: coffee, a radio crackle, a joke shared in a car. The world did not change for him, and that absence of change felt like confirmation. Patterns reward the careless until they don't. The clock had started, but he could not hear it. His record was clean because cleanliness had been curated. Complaints dissolved in process. Names were misspelled. Statements were lost. The system protected its own by design, and he mistook that design for destiny. He believed consequences belonged to other people. He did not consider the sun. He did not consider memory. He did not consider the way communities answer when institutions refuse to. He had learned to fear courts, not neighborhoods. He respected paperwork more than lineage. That imbalance would cost him. When word reached Bumpy Johnson, it did not arrive as rumor. It arrived as fact, shaped by witnesses who understood the weight of what they had seen. The officer, meanwhile, drove home, convinced the day was finished. Dinner waited. Sleep would come. Tomorrow would look like yesterday. The badge lay on a chair that night, metal catching light, ordinary and trusted. He slept with the comfort of repetition, unaware that repetition had finally drawn attention. Authority had made him visible. Carelessness had made him legible. This was not the fall of a mastermind. It was the consequence of a man who confused protection with permanence. He believed the edge of his uniform marked the edge of accountability. Harlem knew better. And as the city prepared its answer, the officer remained certain that nothing ever happened to men like him. Within 72 hours, certainty replaced habit, and the system that hid him failed, quietly, completely, and without witnesses present. Bumpy Johnson heard the news the way he heard most things that mattered, quietly and without witnesses. It arrived through a voice he trusted, measured, careful with language, respectful of what the words carried. There was no need for detail, a slap, a uniform, his father. That was enough. The room did not change shape. The day did not pause. Bumpy did not move. He did not ask questions. Questions imply uncertainty, and there was none. He understood immediately what the act represented, not anger, not even cruelty, but instruction. It was meant to remind an old man and everyone watching where power believed it lived. Bumpy listened, thanked the messenger, and returned to what he had been doing. That return was the reaction. Inside, something hardened, but it did not heat. Rage would have been simple. Rage would have been expected. Rage would have produced noise, and noise creates options for other people. Bumpy preferred fewer options. He treated the insult like a problem of structure, not emotion, something to be corrected so it could not repeat. He thought of his father standing straight in a world designed to bend him. He thought of lessons learned without lectures, about dignity carried silently, about choosing when to speak and when to endure. The slap was not just against flesh, it was against lineage. Allowing it to stand would teach the wrong lesson to the wrong people. Harlem felt the shift before it was named. Phones did not ring faster. Men did not gather. Nothing visible happened. That absence was the signal. When Bumpy reacted quickly, it meant anger. When he did not react at all, it meant design. Those who knew him understood the difference and adjusted their own behavior accordingly. He mapped consequences the way other men mapped streets, carefully, aware of traffic and timing. The officer was not an enemy to be crushed. He was a message to be answered. The answer needed to reach farther than one man and last longer than one night. Anything rushed would shrink the meaning. Bumpy did not speak to his father right away, not because he did not care, but because reassurance could wait. Correction could not. The city needed stability, not comfort. He trusted his father's strength and honored it by not turning pain into spectacle. The slap had been public. The response would be quiet. That balance mattered. Public humiliation demands correction that restores order without inviting escalation. Bumpy understood that law could not be relied upon to teach this lesson. Law had already spoken and said nothing. The city would have to answer instead. He began arranging nothing and everything at once. Conversations shifted tone. Doors opened, then closed. People who were not summoned made themselves available. No one was told why. They did not need to. The shape of the coming response was already understood. This was not vengeance. Vengeance satisfies the injured and alarms everyone else. This was education. Education changes behavior without requiring repetition. Bumpy's silence communicated certainty, and certainty travels faster than threats. Those closest to him watched for a signal that did not come. That absence told them the response would not be loud or immediate. It would arrive complete. The clock had started, not toward violence, but toward consequence. By the time the sun set, Harlem had absorbed the meaning. The insult would not stand. It would be corrected in a way that left no confusion and no audience. Bumpy Johnson did not react because reaction ends moments. He calculated because calculation reshapes them. The city waited, steady and attentive, knowing patience itself was the message, and that when consequences finally arrived, they would arrive fully formed, unmistakable, and impossible to undo without noise or appeal. Tonight. The first hour passed without notice. By the second day, Harlem was watching. The officer returned to his roots, uniform pressed, movements unchanged, confident enough to believe the moment had evaporated. No calls came, no warnings arrived. The city did not react the way outsiders expected, and that silence began to stretch. People noticed what did not happen. No rumors chased him. No men followed. No sudden attention from places that usually noticed everything. That absence was deliberate. In Bumpy Johnson's world, immediacy was mercy. Delay was intention. Each hour allowed uncertainty to grow, and uncertainty does more damage than fear ever could. The cop felt it first as relief. He told himself the slap had disappeared into routine, absorbed by a neighborhood too accustomed to humiliation to respond. He leaned into that belief, letting it settle, letting his guard lower. That was the point. Harlem understood patience as pressure, not restraint. On the streets, behavior adjusted subtly. Conversations shortened when his name surfaced. Eyes tracked him without recognition. He moved through familiar spaces that felt slightly altered, as if the city had shifted its furniture while he wasn't looking. No one confronted him. No one needed to. Time became the mechanism. Each passing hour removed options. Acting too quickly would have framed the response as anger. Waiting reframed it as certainty. Certainty carries weight because it suggests inevitability, and inevitability invites surrender long before force is required. By the third day, the absence became heavy. The officer sensed it without understanding it. He felt watched without seeing watchers. Doors closed faster. Small privileges evaporated. Places that once tolerated him now registered his presence as inconvenience. The city was not hunting him, it was withdrawing. Harlem knew this rhythm well. Consequences rarely announce themselves. They arrived through subtraction. Access faded, protection thinned. Confidence eroded quietly. The punishment was not physical yet, but it was already active, reshaping the ground beneath him. For Bumpy, those 72 hours were not waiting. They were alignment. He allowed every system involved to find its position without instruction. That was the elegance of restraint. When the outcome arrived, it would feel natural, not imposed. People asked nothing because questions disrupt timing. Everyone who mattered understood the clock was intentional. The delay ensured that when silence finally broke, it would do so cleanly, without witnesses needing explanation. The officer continued his routine because routine felt safe. Familiarity dulled instinct. Each day without consequence convinced him the danger had passed, even as the city removed every reason for him to believe it. By the end of the third night, Harlem was quiet in a way that felt final. The warning had already been delivered, not through threats or movement, but through time itself. When the moment came, it would not feel sudden, it would feel overdue. Those hours pressed on the city like weather, unseen but unavoidable. Men adjusted schedules without discussing reasons. Routes changed, meetings postponed. Trust narrowed. The delay forced everyone to confront how little control noise actually provides. Silence required discipline. Discipline required belief. Belief made the outcome certain before it arrived. By stretching time, Bumpy ensured the correction would settle into memory rather than erupt into chaos. When silence finally broke, it would not surprise anyone who mattered. It would simply confirm what patience had already taught Harlem. The city understood that waiting was part of justice, not its absence. Each quiet hour stripped the officer of certainty while reinforcing order everywhere else. By the time consequences arrived, resistance would feel pointless, explanation unnecessary, and the lesson irreversible. This moment was no longer about anger, but about design completing itself. Harlem waited because waiting meant the outcome would hold. Nothing needed to happen for certainty to settle. 72 hours after the slap, the officer was found alive, but unrecognizable to those who knew him. His uniform was intact, his body unmarked, yet something essential had collapsed behind his eyes. Words came out wrong, fractured and looping, as if his thoughts could no longer agree on a single direction. He did not explain where he had been. He did not accuse anyone. He could not even finish a sentence without losing himself inside it. Harlem heard first, not through headlines but through the subtle shift that follows certainty. The man who once walked with authority now moved like someone learning gravity again. He flinched at ordinary sounds. He stared past people instead of at them. Whatever had happened, it had not left bruises, but it had erased confidence completely. There were no witnesses willing to speak because there were none that mattered. Nothing violent had been seen, nothing illegal could be proven. The absence of detail became the detail. That silence told its own story. The system that had shielded him had no answer for his condition. The badge no longer translated into protection. Doctors offered cautious language. Stress, shock, breakdown. Words meant to soften what everyone already understood. Something had reached him that authority could not block. His uniform, once armor, had failed to defend him from consequence that did not need fists or weapons. People noticed how quickly support evaporated. Fellow officers kept distance. Superiors spoke carefully. No one wanted to claim responsibility for a man whose certainty had dissolved. He was alive, yet functionally removed from the world he once dominated. The punishment did not announce itself, but it could not be ignored. Harlem understood the message instantly. The response had not been about revenge. It had been about correction. The slap had been an assertion of dominance. The outcome dismantled that assertion entirely. The officer no longer represented power. He represented warning. Bumpy Johnson did not visit. He did not comment. He did not need to. The lesson had arrived intact without his presence. That restraint mattered. It separated anger from outcome, and that distinction preserved order rather than inflaming it. The man's future narrowed quickly. His authority was gone. His credibility gone with it. The city moved around him as if he were already history. No cheers followed. No celebration broke out. The silence that greeted his condition was not cruelty. It was acceptance. People who had witnessed the slap felt something settle. Not satisfaction, but balance. The humiliation of an elder had been addressed without spectacle. The system that allowed it had been bypassed, not challenged openly, but rendered irrelevant in that moment. This was the kind of power Harlem recognized. Not loud, not chaotic, not desperate. Power that corrected without destroying everything around it. The officer remained alive because death would have made him a story. Living as he was made him a lesson. No blood had been required, no body displayed. Authority everywhere felt the shift. Men in uniforms adjusted their tone. Hands stayed off shoulders. Voices softened around elders. The correction rippled outward quietly, enforced by understanding rather than fear. When people spoke of it later, they did not dwell on what happened to him. They focused on what did not happen afterward. No more slaps, no more public humiliations. The absence of repetition proved the message had landed. Harlem moved on because the outcome restored something essential. Respect, dignity, order. The officer's condition was not the point. The boundary was. And that boundary stood reinforced, visible without being named. The city carried that memory forward, not as gossip or fear, but as instruction, shaping behavior quietly and permanently, long after the moment itself had passed into history without explanation, applause, witnesses needed. After that week, nothing dramatic followed, and that was the proof. No more public humiliations, no casual hands raised in uniform, no performances meant to remind elders of where they stood. The absence of repetition was the message Harlem trusted most. What had happened was not revenge played out for satisfaction. It was correction delivered once, clearly enough to never require rehearsal. Reputation moved faster than rumor. Men who carried authority adjusted their posture, their tone, their distance. Patrols slowed near familiar corners. Conversations ended sooner. Paperwork replaced bravado. No memo explained the change, yet everyone recognized it. Memory does not need explanation when consequences have been demonstrated without spectacle. Bumpy Johnson's father continued his routines without escort or ceremony. He walked as he always had, head level, steps unhurried. The difference lived around him, not within him. Space opened where it had once tightened. Voices softened. The city behaved as if a boundary had been redrawn in ink that could not be erased. This was how order returned, not through fear sustained by repetition, but through understanding sustained by memory. Violence often demands maintenance. Lessons rooted in clarity do not. One event became enough to settle countless interactions before they ever formed. Police officers noticed the shift even if they never named it. Aggression became inconvenient. Disrespect became risky. The uniform no longer guaranteed insulation from consequence that arrived sideways, without paperwork or witnesses. Authority recalibrated itself, quietly choosing caution over habit. Harlem felt steadier, not because danger vanished, but because rules became visible again. Respect stopped being theoretical. It returned as behavior. Doors opened easier. Arguments dissolved sooner. The street learned that dignity, once defended effectively, does not need constant defense. Those who had watched the slap understood the arc fully. The humiliation had been public. The correction had been private. That balance mattered. It kept escalation from feeding itself. It protected the neighborhood from cycles that leave only debris and headlines. No one ever touched Bumpy Johnson's father again because no one needed reminding. The cost had been demonstrated without excess. That restraint preserved the lesson longer than any display of force could have. It allowed the city to move forward without carrying fresh wounds. Stories condensed with time. Details blurred. What remained was the boundary. Elders were not props. Authority was not permission. Power did not excuse humiliation. These understandings settled into habit, where they could do the most good. For Bumpy, this outcome mattered more than any immediate response. He had protected something essential without lighting a fuse that would burn uncontrolled. The city learned without being frightened into chaos. That was the measure of real influence. Fear fades, memory doesn't. Harlem remembered what happened when a line was crossed, and more importantly, what followed when it was corrected properly. The lesson traveled forward intact, shaping behavior long after names and faces changed. Nothing else needed to happen. That was the point. Prevention had replaced retaliation. Boundaries held. The father lived the rest of his days unbothered by displays meant to diminish him. And the city carried on, quieter, steadier, aligned again around an understanding that dignity, once defended wisely, rarely needs defending twice. People sensed the difference immediately. Respect became procedural, almost automatic, woven into daily conduct. No speeches reinforced it, no signs announced it. It lived in pauses, in decisions reversed before harm formed. Harlem did not celebrate this outcome. It absorbed it. Stability returned because humiliation lost its utility. Power adjusted because it had been checked without spectacle. The city learned that prevention preserves dignity longer than punishment, and that restraint, when witnessed clearly once, can govern behavior across generations. That lesson endured quietly, shaping choices long after emotions cooled and witnesses aged away from memory itself. Years later, the officer who once hid behind his badge faded into obscurity. His name stopped circulating, his career ended quietly, and whatever authority he believed permanent dissolved without ceremony. Harlem did not mark his passing. It rarely did. Bumpy Johnson's father, meanwhile, continued aging with dignity and tact. He walked the same streets, greeted neighbors, watched seasons change, and carried himself exactly as he always had. What changed was the space around him. It widened. Respect no longer felt conditional. The incident itself settled into Harlem's memory not as gossip, but as guidance. Elders referenced it sparingly. Younger men absorbed it instinctively. No one embellished it. No one needed to. The lesson was simple enough to travel intact. Authority, the story taught, is temporary. Dignity is not. Uniforms change, laws shift, power moves hands, but memory outlasts all of it. Harlem understood that power used loudly invites resistance, while power used precisely creates order. Bumpy Johnson never spoke publicly about what happened. He did not frame it as victory. He allowed the outcome to speak for itself. That restraint became part of his larger legend, not because it frightened people, but because it clarified limits. Over time, the story lost faces, dates, and specifics. What remained was the boundary. Elders were not to be humiliated. Authority was not permission. Power did not excuse cruelty. These ideas became habits, reinforced quietly through behavior rather than threats. Harlem carried that understanding forward, adjusting interactions before conflict could form. Officers chose caution. Residents chose patience. Disputes ended earlier. Escalation lost its appeal. The city felt steadier, not because fear lingered, but because clarity did. This was the quiet aftermath of a moment that never needed repetition. One boundary, once demonstrated, proved sufficient. The system adjusted itself, removing the need for constant enforcement. As years passed, new faces filled the streets, unaware of the specifics but guided by the outcome. They inherited the behavior, not the anger. That distinction mattered. It allowed the lesson to endure without reopening wounds. Some men are remembered for violence. Others are remembered for the limits they enforced. Bumpy Johnson belonged to the latter. His influence did not rely on spectacle. It relied on memory strong enough to govern behavior. Harlem never forgot because it never needed reminding. The lesson lived in posture, tone, and restraint. It shaped choices long after the badge lost its meaning. The story did not end with triumph, but with understanding. Power exercised quietly lasted longer than force. Dignity, once defended wisely, remained intact. That understanding lingered, carried forward through habit rather than fear. It allowed a community to protect itself without constant conflict. When people looked back, they didn't see a slap. They saw a boundary restored. They saw how restraint reshaped power. That was the lesson that outlived the badge, the uniform, and the moment itself. It remained as quiet instruction, guiding behavior without demand. Harlem carried it forward, ensuring dignity stayed protected, long after names faded and faces changed. The city remembered not through fear, but through understanding, and that understanding proved stronger than any display of force. In that quiet remembrance, order endured, boundaries held, and the lesson remained intact, passed carefully from one generation to the next, ensuring respect survived long after anger had no place left to live. That was how Harlem chose to remember, not the harm, but the boundary that ended it, quietly, completely, and forever, without needing to be enforced again, allowing dignity to stand untouched, steady, and understood long after the uniform lost authority, the badge lost meaning, and the city moved forward, guided by memory rather than fear, as intended.